Jack, why can't you stay out of the justice system? Why are you back in court again, Jack?
Well, I can only tell you about the third case, but I'm not really sure because at Masterpiece Cake Shop, we serve everybody who comes into our shop, but we just can't create every cake that people ask us to create. It's because of the message in most cases. Or it's the message in all cases. It's never the person who's asking for the cake.
But do you at this point feel, Jack, you're on your at least second round here, after being asked to bake a cake to celebrate a same-sex wedding, you're now being asked, or you have been asked, to bake a cake celebrating a gender transition. This can't be a random confluence of events. Do you feel at this point targeted?
Well, the person who's suing us in what is now our third lawsuit and the second lawsuit was in contact with us back in 2012, within 2 weeks of the two men who came in and requested the same-sex wedding cake, connecting with me by email, calling me a bigot and a hypocrite, and later on asking for like a cake with Satan smoking marijuana. So this person has been targeting us for a good 10 years now.
So let me see if I can get the facts nailed down as well, Jack. So this person, who I believe as well is an attorney, came to your bake shop after have already sent you emails calling you a bigot and then requesting that you bake a cake. Tell me about that cake. Tell me about both of those cakes that this person has requested that Masterpiece Cake Shop produce.
Well, this happened on the cake request came in the very day that the United States Supreme Court announced that they were going to hear our case, which was monumental. Not just in my mind. It's incredibly hard for the U.S. Supreme Court to hear a case. They turn away 99% of them. So we have a lot of media here, a lot of friends, a lot of family, and it's a very chaotic day. And the phone rang, and this person called and asked us if we could create a cake that was pink on the inside and blue on the outside, and that those colors were to signify gender transition, changing from a man to a woman. And so when we explained to this person that that was a message that we couldn't express, but we'd be glad to create other custom work, or you can come into my shop and buy anything that's here. I'm glad to serve you. I serve everybody, but that's a message that we can't express. And so that person filed a complaint with the Colorado Civil Rights Division. They turned it over to the commission, and the commission filed a complaint against us, or a lawsuit against us. And that lawsuit took effect 3 weeks after the probable cause that they announced took place. 3 weeks after we received our 7-2 victory at the U.S. Supreme Court in June of 2018.
And you mentioned just a moment ago, Jack, just to complete the picture, that there was also a third request, a third cake that was also asked for by the same individual?
Yeah. So this person, like I said, had sent me emails calling me a hypocrite and a bigot, and also asked for a cake with Satan smoking marijuana. We wouldn't do that for anybody. So it's a message of a cake that I declined to express. And so this person was trying to, get us to do a cake that we couldn't do.
Now, Jake, I would love to bring you in here. As we walk through this conversation, we've laid down the facts. I want to walk through not just the legal analysis, which is important, but I also want to walk through the way that the common American, the common news consumer, might consume this story. But let's first start with the legal analysis. I heard Jack just a moment ago say, we'll serve anybody, but not every message. That seems to be a very, very, very important distinction in this case. So if someone says to you, now maybe a common news consumer, hey, you can't reject a black consumer at the lunch counter, akin to the 1960s, because of your religious beliefs, your response to that is how and why do you distinguish this form of discrimination? And by the way, I use the word discrimination not to imply or impute guilt, but in the true form of that word, discrimination, meaning to employ judgment and make a decision.
Well, here Jack serves everyone. He just can't express every message through his custom cakes. And Jack's an artist. He's an artist just like photographers, writers, calligraphers, painters, filmmakers. And all these people, they deal in speech. The restaurateur or the person offering food at a lunch counter, they're not dealing in speech, but Jack is. And the First Amendment protects his right to create art with messages that are consistent with his deepest beliefs. But what we've seen over the past 10 years or so is activists and government officials targeting artists like Jack just because they disagree with some of their views on life's biggest issues like marriage and gender. But they shouldn't misuse the law to try to punish people they disagree with. The First Amendment protects artists like Jack. Free speech is for everyone.
I want to ask both of you this. I'll stay with you, Jake, on the legal analysis first. I believe your opposing counsel has argued this, at least in one of your many cases. Is this really about Jack's speech or the customer's speech? So in other words, if he bakes the cake, whatever it may say, right, celebrating a same-sex wedding or celebrating a gender transition, or even the Satan smoking a marijuana cake, is that a reflection of Jack's values and Jack's speech as an artist, or is he simply the vehicle for the customer's speech? First to you, Jake.
Well, absolutely, it's Jack's speech, and we highlight many of the artistic elements that Jack brings to the table here. He envisions what the cake is going to communicate. He paints, he sketches, he sculpts the cake, and courts around the country have recognized that art often involves a sequence of events, often by different parties. But setting all that aside, the U.S. Supreme Court has already said that the government can't force someone to express even another person's message. So here, the First Amendment very clearly protects Jack's right to serve everyone, but to decline to express messages that go against his deepest beliefs.
And so if I'm to understand this completely, Jack, now let's walk through these examples one at a time. If the same-sex couple, in the case where you've already won at the Supreme Court, walks into Masterpiece Cake Shop and says to you, hey, we would like for you to bake a birthday cake with no message in particular or unique on this birthday cake, but a same-sex couple requests that you bake a birthday cake, your response to that is what?
When do you need it? What flavor do you like? What time? How many people? That's a message that I love to express. But in this case, the two men told me that it was a cake to celebrate a same-sex wedding. And in the third case that we're in our current lawsuit, the person told us that those colors were to signify a gender transition. So it was a message that I couldn't express, and we tried to, explain that to the person and create other work for you. You're welcome in our shop. We welcome everybody. But this is not a case strictly just about Jack Phillips and Masterpiece Cake Shop. This is a case for every American. Jake was talking about speechwriters or videographers, painters. Every American should have the right to live and work freely according to their conscience without fear of punishment from the government. These are message-based arguments. They're not person-based.
Yeah, and that's the key. These are message-based arguments. So just to put a fine point on this, then, to go to the second example, if a transgender individual comes into your shop and says, I would like for you to bake me a Super Bowl cake or whatever it might be, your response to that, again, is what?
Well, it's a little bit early for a Super Bowl, but we'd be glad to serve that, and create that. And, sit down and talk about the size, the flavor, the time. It doesn't matter what their gender orientation, sexual orientation, gender identity is. It's always the message of the cake.
Right. And by the way, I don't know if it is geographically relevant for you, Jack, but it's very early. Should it be a Denver Broncos Super Bowl? Because that looks like very far off in the distant future.
That's what I hear, yeah.
For the Broncos. How important, Jake, is it, and you've returned to this phrase several times, that Jack is an artist? So, in other words, is it important to your argument that Jack isn't mass-producing cakes and has them out, displayed like a Safeway, for example, and will only make cakes with a certain message? Is it important that he is distinguished from that mass production retail shop and that he is an artist?
Absolutely. Jack's not pressing a copy button. He's creating custom cakes from scratch. He's painting, he's sculpting, he's sketching these cakes. It shouldn't matter that his canvas is edible. What matters is that he's expressing a message. And there's a clear distinction between the government forcing an artist like Jack, to custom create a cake that expresses a particular message versus forcing someone like Jack to sell some cookies off the shelf or a pre-made cake. Because what the Supreme Court has said is that the First Amendment protects our freedom of mind. And when you start forcing someone to create and design a message from scratch, you're really getting into someone's mind, and you're forcing them to do something that the government should never force anyone to do. And we believe that principle holds true even for people who disagree with Jack on life's biggest issues. For example, we don't think the government should force a website designer who identifies as LGBT to create custom websites celebrating views of marriage that goes against their deepest beliefs. Free speech is truly for everyone, and what we're fighting for in these cases is the right of every American to say what they believe without fear of government punishment.
So that's an interesting analogy you just drew. You both have invoked some other examples requiring a liberal or progressive or Democrat speechwriter to write speeches for a Republican candidate for president or for President Trump. Forcing people to adopt certain messages seems to be at the crux of your case. And you just turned it on its head there, Jake, in that we know there's a case going before the Supreme Court where a Colorado web designer doesn't want to design websites, I believe, that celebrate gay weddings. But what you just did is turned it on its head and say, well, also an LGBTQ web designer shouldn't be forced to produce a website that produces anti-LGBTQ messages. And in fact, that happened in your that argument was made in your original case, was it not, with the same-sex marriage case, Jack's first case, in that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission said it was okay, I believe, for a gay baker to decline a Christian customer who had an anti-same-sex marriage message, but wouldn't extend that same freedom to Jack.
That's exactly right. During Jack's first case, a religious man went to 3 other cake artists in Denver and said, hey, can you create me a custom cake criticizing same-sex marriage? Well, all 3 of those artists declined to create that cake, citing message-based concerns. Well, that religious man, like the 2 men in Jack's first case, filed a charge with the Civil Rights Commission. But instead of prosecuting those 3 cake artists like they prosecuted Jack, the commission gave them a pass. They said that the First Amendment protects their right from being able to express that message. But the commission denied that same freedom to Jack. So when Jack's first case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, the court said, look, Colorado, you're discriminating against religious cake artists like Jack. You can't allow message-based objections, or you can't allow First Amendment protections for secular cake artists, but deny them for religious cake artists. That's religious discrimination. So that was one of the key pillars of the Supreme Court's decision a few years ago when it ruled in favor of Jack.
What does that tell you, Jack, when you see that discrepancy, when you see the way that your situation just run in the opposite was treated so differently in Colorado? How do you explain that? What is that about?
I would have to say that it was just the individual commissioners that made that decision, but that should be something that all Americans should not have to fear. No American should have to worry about a commission or a human rights whatever body saying that you can do this and you can't, and we're going to determine which speech is appropriate. That's why this case is so important for every American, creative professionals like myself or just the average person on the street. It's going to value these freedoms, even more so if they're taken away, so we have to fight for them.
You know, Jack, I mentioned earlier that I want to talk about this from the technical legal angle, but I also want to talk about it sort of at the conversational angle, that a casual news consumer may let this information wash over them the way we often do when we consume news. They get the headlines, right? They see Colorado baker won't bake gay wedding cake, whatever it may be. And I think one of the things, I want to ask you what that casual consumer who's not read in may think to themselves. So I want to ask you at a deeper level, you can answer it, but the shallow question, hey man, why don't you just do the cake? Why don't you just bake the cake? Don't be a jerk, bake the cake. What would be your answer to that person who thinks of this story on those terms?
You know, I have a lot of people that come into the shop and ask me those very questions face to face, and I'm able to explain to them that it's not just a cake. This is a message that I'm planning to express, and we're trying to fight for the rights of, I'm talking to you, and I'm telling you that you're going to value these rights. They're important to you. No American should be forced to say something that they don't want to say. We think of free speech as I can say whatever I want, but the reverse, the opposite, is also true. You should not be compelled to say something that goes against what you believe. And in my case, in cake art, But in their case, I try and find a common ground, to whatever their occupation is, and explain to them that, ground level, this is how this affects you. This is how it's going to affect your kids. This is how it's going to affect your family. And it's so important that we have these freedoms and that they're protected.
Yeah, and there's so many ways you could draw that analogy and find that common ground. And honestly, regardless of whether or not they're left or right, Republican or Democrat, everybody wants to be able to control their own thoughts and their own messages, pro or anti-abortion, whatever it may be. I can't imagine that you can find a way to touch. Is that, by the way, where you could find a way to have that touch point with anybody? Is that right, Jack, by the way? People are coming in and asking you that kind of exact casual question that I just asked you?
Occasionally they do, or they call me up. Just say, hey, I heard about your story in the news, and, wouldn't it just be easier for you and your family if you just made the cake? And if I just made the cake and these rights keep being chipped away and chiseled away, and then they're gone, then it wouldn't be worth it at all. So it's more important than creating a cake. This case, in my mind, has grown. It's a long time ago, but I realized that it was not just about Jack Phillips and Masterpiece Cake Shop. It was so much more important than that. And that came to my mind. I realized that back when we were deciding whether or not to go to the United States Supreme Court to file the petition. And I was thinking about it. It's like, they're already not hearing our case. What's the worst that could happen? We file the search, and they say, nope, I'm not going to hear it, and it's official. That's the worst that could happen. It was pointed out to me, no. The worst that could happen would be that they take your case and you lose.
It's really fascinating how you describe that, Jack, because it is bigger than you. I think that's clear for anyone listening and anyone that understands the potential threat to not just free expression, but to free thought. But it's also very personal to you as well. I mean, you've been through a lot, Jack. I mean, what are we looking at now? Well over a decade of fights here, and fights that you didn't necessarily invite or ask for. You're the defendant in all of these instances. What does that mean? What does that feel like? What have you experienced?
Well, in the first week or two, I was fielding nothing but hate mail and hateful phone calls. But I determined that it didn't matter. When I answered the phone, I'd say, Masterpiece Cake Shop, this is Jack. Can I help you? And I'd try and do it with a smile, and whatever they would say to me or whatever, respond to that, but respond in kindness. And I took a phone call, and, are you Jack? Yeah. Well, I'm on my way to your shop. Okay. And I've got a gun. And I'm going to come blow your head off. And so I'm thinking, my daughter's in the back. My granddaughter, who's almost 4 years old, is back there with her. And I'm not afraid if this guy comes in, but I don't want them to be around. So I thought, I'm going to call the police and, err that way. And the guy kept calling and saying, now I'm on this street and I'm in that street, and, trying to figure out who's going to be here in 10 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever. And the police showed up, and the police tried to trace the call and couldn't do it. And the guy never showed up, and I don't know if he just pulled into the parking lot, saw the police car in the front, and then changed his mind, or if it was just a bogus threat. But I'm just realizing, there was more to this than just the cake. And then, like I was saying, even more to it, going to the Supreme Court and losing, how much effect that would have on everybody, not just me, not just my shop, my granddaughter, my daughter, my family, but every American, because we should all be able to live and work freely and speak what we want and not be compelled to speak messages that we don't want. And so there we go.
Well, what a story, Jack, and I can hear the emotion as you retell that story. Is that a unique story, or has that type of thing been a common occurrence?
No, at the very beginning, it was not common, but, for a guy that's in a, birthday business and people are always happy to see you, and, it was pretty uncommon and pretty unsettling. I had another guy who was calling me regularly, telling me he was going to come over with his machete and chop me up into little pieces, and just hateful phone calls. But we also had incredible support. When we were in court this last summer, or summer before, we had a gay man who has come into my shop, introduced himself one day when we first made the news as a gay man. He said, hi, how can I help you? sold him some cookies, whatever, and he came back again and again and again, and we've become friends. Enough so that when we were in court back in March of 2021, he testified on our behalf, saying that Jack serves me, he serves everybody, but he understood that it was the message of the cakes that we were involved with in the courts that was problematic.
What a message of inspiration there. What a message of hope that human beings can actually see each other as human beings. Jake, I haven't forgotten your part in this conversation. I want to return to you as well in just one moment. But just a couple more human questions here, Jack. That's got to be something every time your door opens. I don't know if you have a bell on the door, or if you have to ring people in. I don't know what your business is like on a physical perspective. Every time the phone rings, you've almost got to put your guard up. You've almost got to be protected. You've almost got to be nervous every time that door opens.
Well, when the two men stormed out of my shop back in 2012, that was unusual enough. But then 20 minutes later, the phone rang, and it's not my job to answer the phone. I had two people working for me that afternoon. It was their job first, but they were both busy. So I picked up the phone, and it was a crazy phone call, and the guy ends up calling me names and threatening me that he'd already heard about this 20 minutes earlier. That's weird. And then the phone rang again, and so I told the two girls that were there that afternoon, I'll be answering the phone from here on out. And the phone calls just didn't stop. For days and days and days, nonstop phone calls, threats, just belittling you and swearing at you. And so it had always since then, 10 years ago, it became my job to answer the phone. I answer it all the time, and then if it's just something else, I can pass it off. But just to protect my employees, I took that step, made that decision to be the one to field everything that came in that way.
You mentioned the support. What's happened to your business over the last decade? How is it going?
We're still in business, and it's entirely different. At the time that the two men came in that week, I had 10 people on my payroll, and then shortly after that, it was down to 4, including me. Now we've added a couple more part-time people, and by part-time, I mean like 8 to 10, 12 hours a week. So it's still, the wedding business was a large part of our business, and so we haven't recovered that yet. So,
Jake, back to you. This is such an interesting story in that it is so personal and individual to Jack, but as he's alluded to on numerous occasions, and one of the reasons he's willing to continue in the fight is that it is bigger than Jack. I think it's bigger than Jack, both symbolically and legally. So, first, symbolically, is there a reason, in your estimation, Jake, that Jack continues to be the center of this story? I mentioned a moment ago, it's not a coincidence, right, that now he's on his third round, that this individual who wants the transgender or gender transition cake and the Satan cake went to Jack, not another cake shop.
Well, at this point, Jack's the most famous cake artist in America, right? And people know that Jack is going to stand by his faith. He's not going to abandon his faith when hard times come. And that's true of every client that ADF represents. We represent artists all around the country, advocating for their right to say what they believe without fear of government punishment. So it's no surprise that people like Jack are the ones who are being targeted because they're the ones who are going to stick it through, no matter what comes his way. So he proved that going all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court in his first case, and we're back on that track now. But I think this highlights a broader point about where we should be as a culture, right? Because we're a pluralistic country. And we want to see a country where free speech is treasured, not just for the favored few, but for all Americans. And that's what Jack and that's what Lori Smith, the web designer going before the Supreme Court later this fall, and what so many other artists around the country are fighting for. It's not just so that they can say what they believe. They're fighting for the right of every American to say what they believe without fear of government punishment, because we truly believe here at Alliance Defending Freedom that free speech is for everyone. No exceptions.
Yeah, and I can't help but think that symbolically there's something more here as well, that what is at the center of the fight is not necessarily equal access to the market, not equal access to goods and services, but actually forced conformity, that Jack becomes a symbol of, well, all of us. And I think Jack alluded to that a moment ago, where the goal seems to be that we all think the same, that we all submit, that we all end up with the same point of view. And the cake is just the vehicle for that. And then so last thing to you, Jake, is obviously the bigger fight, though, is one of free expression.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And to add on to the point you just mentioned, the U.S. Supreme Court mentioned in Jack's first case that the Colorado officials were trying to basically kick him out of the marketplace. They were telling him that there's no place for people like you and people with your views here in Denver. But that's not what the First Amendment allows. That's not what our country is about. And like I said earlier, people like Jack, they're fighting for the right of every American to say what they believe without fear of government punishment. And when you take it out of this context, this is a sensitive cultural context right now, but when we get outside of this context, we can see the principle more clearly. Say a Ukrainian cake artist set up shop in downtown Denver, and someone called them up and said, "Hey, do you create custom cakes with black icing?" "Sure." "Do you put letters on cakes?" "Yeah." "Well, how about you put a big white Z on the cake? Can you do that?" It's like, "Yeah, I've done that for a birthday cake before." But then the person says, "Oh, but I'm a Russian nationalist, and this cake is going to celebrate the Russian invasion of Ukraine." No one in America is going to say that that cake artist should be forced to express that message. And that's the same thing here. When we get outside of this context, we see the bigger principle at play. Free speech is for everyone. The government shouldn't be in the business of forcing artists to say things that they don't believe.
And I want to challenge and I want to push, because I know what the detractors say to both of you. They say, what if Jack's religious beliefs were such that he believed that African Americans were less than other Americans? And he grounded that idea in his religion. Would he then therefore be allowed to discriminate? But I don't even have to ask that question, because you both have done the job of answering that through our conversation, that it's about a message. It's not about a person. Free expression, Jack's religion protects that he doesn't have to adopt a certain message. It doesn't protect him from being discriminatory towards another human being and their identity and their status. Is that fair summation, Jake?
Spot on. People like Jack, they serve everyone. They just can't express every message. And the Supreme Court has made a big distinction between those who oppose, for example, interracial marriage. Back in the Loving case, the U.S. Supreme Court said that those kinds of objections are invidious discrimination. But if you remember in Obergefell, the Supreme Court said that decent and honorable people hold the belief that God designed marriage to be between man and a woman. Here, Jack serves everyone. He just can't express every message, and the First Amendment protects artists like him.
Well, Jake, I really appreciate you coming on and giving us that perspective about the legal fight and the bigger fight ahead of both you and Jack, and really all of us as a society. And Jack, I really appreciate you sharing your personal story. I think it's easy to get lost in a lot of the debate and the abstractions and the principles, and they're all important, but really, honestly, there's also a human being at the center of this story, and I appreciate you sharing that story as well. Thank you so much, Jake and Jack.
Thanks for having us.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain podcast for full episodes right now.